A poor girl slept in the playground every night, until the cold, rich owner came to expel her. What he discovered made him burst into tears. Vincent Langford had built an empire from marble and meanness. His hotel wasn't just luxury. It was a fortress of white stone and velvet drapes that whispered wealth to anyone who dared step inside. The private playground tucked behind the main building like a guilty secret. No child had ever played there. Not once. Vincent told people it was for aesthetic balance, but the truth carved deeper than his carefully maintained exterior. Every swing, every slide, every bright red monkey bar had been installed 15 years ago for a son who would never use them. A son whose name he couldn't say without his chest tightening like a fist around his heart. Each morning, Vincent made his rounds with the precision of a general inspecting troops. Coffee in hand. Always a double-shot latte, no sugar. He'd walk the perimeter of his kingdom, checking that everything remained exactly as he'd left it. Perfect. Untouchable. Empty. This particular morning started like all the others. Gray sky promising rain, the kind of dawn that made even millionaires feel mortal. Vincent pushed through the glass doors leading to the playground, already rehearsing his mental checklist, when something stopped him cold. There, curled beneath the blue spiral slide like some woodland creature seeking shelter, was a sleeping bag. And inside that sleeping bag, barely visible except for a tangle of dark hair and one bare foot poking out, was a girl. Vincent's first instinct was fury. Pure, crystalline rage that someone, some homeless vagrant, had dared to invade his sanctuary. His hand tightened on the coffee cup until his knuckles went white. "Hey!" His voice cracked across the playground like a whip. "This is private property." The sleeping bag rustled. Slowly, like a flower opening to reluctant sunlight, a face emerged. She couldn't have been more than 11, maybe 12, with scraped sneakers that had seen better decades and hair that looked like she'd been wrestling with the wind. But her eyes held the kind of ancient tiredness that didn't belong on a child's face. She blinked at him once, twice, then yawned like he was the most boring thing she'd encountered all week. "Morning to you too, Mr. Grumpy." She stretched her arms above her head, completely unbothered by his towering presence. "Sleep well in your castle?" Vincent felt his blood pressure spike. "I don't know how you got in here, but you need to leave. Now." The girl sat up fully, studying him with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Her gaze traveled from his perfectly pressed suit to his Italian leather shoes to the steam still rising from his coffee cup. "Tell you what," she said, and her grin was pure mischief wrapped in morning sunlight. "If you can win, I'll leave." "Win what?" "Anything. Your choice. But if I win, I get to stay another night." Vincent stared at her. In 30 years of business, he'd negotiated million-dollar deals, crushed competitors, and built an empire through sheer force of will. And here was this slip of a girl, this nobody from nowhere, challenging him like they were equals on some cosmic playground. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but something in his chest, something that had been cold and quiet for so long he'd forgotten it existed, began to stir. The girl's grin widened, and she tilted her head like a fox with a secret too delicious to keep. "So is sleeping in a hotel bed when there's a perfectly good slide right here. But here we are." Vincent wanted to call security. Should have called security. Instead, he heard himself asking, "What kind of challenge?" "Oh, now you're interested." She scrambled to her feet with the quick grace of someone who'd learned to move fast when the world got dangerous. "How about arm wrestling?" "Arm wrestling? You can't be serious." "Dead serious." "But," she held up one finger, already establishing terms like a seasoned negotiator, "you have to use your left hand. That's only fair, considering you've got about 100 pounds on me." And that's how Vincent Langford, owner of one of the city's most exclusive hotels, found himself kneeling on his own playground at 7 in the morning, left arm locked with a homeless girl who couldn't weigh more than 80 pounds soaking wet. She won. Of course she won. "Better luck tomorrow, Mr. Grumpy," she called as she rolled up her sleeping bag with practiced efficiency. Same time, same place. Vincent stood there, coffee growing cold in his forgotten hand, watching her disappear through a gap in the hedge he hadn't even known existed. His left shoulder ached, his pride stung, and somewhere deep in his chest, that cold, quiet thing stirred again. For the first time in 15 years, Vincent Langford was looking forward to tomorrow morning. She came back. Of course she came back. Vincent told himself he wasn't waiting for her, wasn't checking his watch as he made his morning rounds, wasn't feeling that strange flutter of anticipation as he approached the playground. But when he saw that familiar sleeping bag tucked beneath the slide, he couldn't quite suppress the smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Ready for round two?" she called before he'd even announced himself. She was already sitting up, hair still mussed from sleep, but eyes bright with challenge. "I could just call security," Vincent said, but they both knew he wouldn't. "You could, but then you'd never know if you could beat me at anything." She stood and stretched, and Vincent noticed she was wearing the same clothes as yesterday. The same clothes she'd probably been wearing for weeks. Besides, where's the fun in that? This time she challenged him to riddles. Riddles she clearly made up on the spot, with answers that made sense only in the twisted logic of childhood. What has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and makes grown men cry at night? Vincent rubbed his temples. I I don't know. A hotel owner who misses his family. Her grin was impish, but her eyes held depths he wasn't ready to explore. "I win again." Day 3 was a race to the garden gate. She declared herself the winner halfway through when Vincent's expensive shoes proved no match for wet grass and morning dew. Day 4 was a staring contest. She won when Vincent blinked first, distracted by the way she held herself so still, like she'd had years of practice being invisible. By the end of the first week, Vincent's staff had begun to whisper. Margaret, his assistant of 30 years, raised an eyebrow when she found him lingering by the playground windows. The bellhops exchanged glances when he took longer routes that happened to pass by the back courtyard. "There's a ghost in the playground," young Tommy from housekeeping whispered to the day shift manager. "Mr. Langford's been talking to someone, but there's never anyone there when we look." But there was someone there. Always someone there, with her ridiculous challenges and her knowing smile and her way of making Vincent feel like he was the one who didn't belong in his own space. She refused to tell him her name. "Names are powerful things," she said on day 8, after beating him at a contest to see who could balance on 1 foot longest. "Can't just go giving them away to strangers. I'm not a stranger. This is my property. Owning something doesn't make you know it." She settled back into her sleeping bag with the satisfied air of someone who'd just delivered profound wisdom. "Besides, you haven't told me your name either." Vincent opened his mouth to argue, then realized she was right. In all their morning encounters, he'd been Mr. Grumpy, Mr. Hotel Man, or simply you. Never Vincent. Never anything real. "Vincent," he said quietly. "Vincent Langford." Her expression shifted, just slightly. The mischief remained, but something softer crept in around the edges. "Nice to meet you, Vincent Langford. I'm still not telling you my name." But she did start accepting small kindnesses. When Tommy the bellhop left a wrapped sandwich near the slide, she took it. When Margaret accidentally left a thermos of hot chocolate on the garden bench, it was empty by evening. Vincent noticed everything. The way she never asked for anything directly but accepted what was freely given. The way she seemed to have an internal clock that kept her invisible during busy hotel hours but present for their dawn encounters. The way she moved through his space like she belonged there, like she'd always belonged there. Most of all, he noticed the haunted look that crossed her face when she thought no one was watching. In those unguarded moments, the clever girl with all the answers disappeared, replaced by someone small and tired and achingly alone. It was Margaret who finally said what Vincent couldn't bring himself to voice. "She's just a child, Vincent." His assistant stood beside him at the office window, both of them watching the girl practice handstands against the slide. "You used to care about those." The words hit him like cold water. Once he had cared. Once, he'd been the kind of man who would have scooped up a homeless child without a second thought, who would have moved heaven and earth to make sure she was safe and fed and loved. But that was before the phone call that shattered his world, before the funeral he couldn't bring himself to attend, before 15 years of carefully constructed emptiness designed to ensure he'd never hurt like that again. "She's not my responsibility," he said, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. Margaret's reflection in the window showed him a look he remembered from his childhood, the same expression his own mother used to wear when he was being particularly stubborn. "When did you become the kind of man who walks past a child in need?" That night, Vincent couldn't sleep. He found himself at the playground window, watching the small mound of her sleeping bag beneath the slide. The autumn air was getting colder. Soon, the first frost would come, and even the best sleeping bag wouldn't be enough. As he watched, she shifted in her sleep, and something fell from her bag. A small shape that caught the moonlight. In the morning, he would find out what it was. In the morning, everything would change. But for now, he just stood at the window, watching over a girl who refused to give him her name, and wondered when his heart had started beating again. Vincent's morning ritual had become something he'd never admit out loud. He looked forward to it. The verbal sparring, the ridiculous challenges, the way she made him feel like he was playing a game he'd forgotten how to play. But on this particular Tuesday, when the October air carried the first real bite of winter, the playground was empty. No sleeping bag under the slide. No mischievous grin waiting to ambush him with impossible riddles. Just silence that felt heavier than it should have. Vincent stood there longer than usual, coffee growing cold in his hands, telling himself he was relieved. Finally, the little vagrant had moved on. His sanctuary could return to its pristine, untouchable state. So why did his chest feel hollow? He paced the perimeter once, twice. On the third lap, something made him look beyond the manicured edges of his playground, past the perfectly trimmed hedge that bordered the property. That's where he found her. She was slumped against the trunk of an old oak tree, knees drawn up to her chest, shivering despite the oversized jacket that hung off her thin shoulders like borrowed armor. Her face was pale as morning frost, and when she coughed, the sound rattled in her chest like coins in an empty jar. Jesus, Vincent breathed, dropping to one knee beside her. How long have you been out here? She looked up at him with glassy eyes that took a moment too long to focus. Vincent, her voice was barely a whisper. Did I miss our match? Hospital. The word came out sharper than he intended, business mode kicking in the way it always did in a crisis. We're going to the hospital. Now. But the moment he reached for her, she scrambled backward with the desperate panic of a wild animal cornered. Her back hit the tree trunk with a soft thud, and she pressed herself against it like she could disappear into the bark. No hospitals. Each word seemed to cost her. They take you, then forget you. That's what they do. They take you and forget you, and you disappear, and nobody comes looking because nobody cares enough to remember your name. The words tumbled out in a rush, fever bright and desperate, and something inside Vincent's chest cracked wide open. Not broke. He'd been broken for 15 years. This was different. This was the sound of ice finally giving way to something warm underneath. He'd heard those words before. Different voice, different time, but the same bone-deep terror of being forgotten. Of disappearing into a system that dealt in numbers instead of names, in cases instead of hearts. Okay, he said softly, the way he'd once spoken to a frightened boy hiding under a hospital bed. No hospitals, but you can't stay out here. She studied his face through fever-hazed eyes, looking for the lie, the trap, the inevitable disappointment that adults always delivered. Whatever she saw there must have passed some internal test, because she nodded once, a tiny movement that seemed to take all her remaining strength. Vincent scooped her up as gently as he could, surprised by how little she weighed, how fragile she felt in his arms. She didn't protest, didn't fight, just tucked her head against his shoulder and let herself be carried like the child she was. Margaret was waiting in the lobby when they came through the back entrance, as if she'd sensed the crisis through some mystical assistant intuition. She took one look at the girl in Vincent's arms and immediately shifted into the mode that had made her indispensable for 30 years. Guest cottage, she said without being asked. I'll get blankets and call Dr. Morrison, the one who makes house calls. No doctors, the girl mumbled against Vincent's shirt. Dr. Morrison is different, Margaret said, her voice taking on the tone she'd once used with Vincent's son during his own stubborn phases. He's been patching up strays for 40 years. Won't ask questions you don't want to answer. They settled her in the small guest cottage behind the main hotel, a place Vincent had built years ago for visiting executives, but rarely used. Margaret worked with quiet efficiency, soft blankets, hot soup that smelled like childhood comfort, a warm washcloth for the girl's flushed face. Vincent hovered uselessly, a man accustomed to taking charge reduced to wringing his hands while watching this slip of a girl battle fever and exhaustion. When Dr. Morrison arrived, a kind-faced man with silver hair and gentle hands, the girl allowed the examination with the weary resignation of someone who'd learned that fighting only made things worse. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and a respiratory infection that's been brewing for weeks, the doctor told Vincent quietly while the girl dozed. Nothing life-threatening if she gets rest and proper care. But Vincent, Dr. Morrison's expression grew serious. This child has been living rough for a long time. The kind of long time that leaves marks on more than just the body. That night, Vincent found himself keeping vigil in the cottage's small sitting area, ostensibly reading hotel reports, but really just listening to the sound of steady breathing from the bedroom. Around midnight, he heard movement and looked up to find the girl standing in the doorway, wrapped in one of Margaret's quilts like a small ghost. "Can't sleep," she said simply. "Fever keeping you up?" She shook her head and padded over to the window seat, curling up with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to make herself comfortable anywhere. "Too quiet. I'm used to other sounds." Vincent didn't ask what sounds. The city had its own nighttime symphony for those who lived on its streets. Sirens and traffic and the constant hum of a world that never truly slept. Silence, for someone like her, might feel more dangerous than noise. They sat in comfortable quiet for a while, and Vincent found himself really looking at her for the first time without the armor of their morning games between them. She was so young, younger than he'd let himself acknowledge, with proper meals and safety and someone to worry about whether she came home at night. She could be any suburban kid curled up with a book on a rainy evening. That's when he noticed her backpack, sitting beside the bed like a faithful dog. Something had fallen out of the front pocket, a small shape that caught the lamplight. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the object. The girl followed his gaze, and something shifted in her expression. Not embarrassment, exactly, but a kind of vulnerable honesty that made her look even younger. "Her name's Rosie," she said quietly, reaching over to pick up what Vincent now realized was a doll. A plastic doll that had clearly seen better decades, with tangled hair and clothes that were more holes than fabric. One of her painted eyes was missing, leaving a small crater in the plastic face. The girl cradled the doll against her chest with the fierce protectiveness of someone guarding their most precious treasure. "She's been with me since." The girl's voice trailed off, and she pressed her lips to the doll's faded hair. "Since always. My mom gave her to me when I was little. Said Rosie would keep me safe when she couldn't." Vincent's throat felt tight. "And has she kept you safe?" The girl considered this with the gravity of a philosopher contemplating the nature of existence. "Safe enough," she said finally. "We take care of each other." She turned the doll over, and Vincent saw something that made his breath catch. There, etched into the plastic foot in faded black marker, was a name, Leah. "Leah," he said softly, and the girl's head snapped up like he'd spoken magic. "How did you?" She followed his gaze to the doll's foot and let out a shaky laugh. "Oh, yeah, that's me. Leah." She said her own name like she was trying it on for size. "I carved that when I was 6. In case I forgot who I was." Vincent's hand trembled as he reached out, not to take the doll, but just to touch one gentle finger to the faded letters. "Leah," he repeated, and this time it sounded like a prayer. "But only because you've seen my worst cough," she added with a flash of her old spirit. "And because you didn't call the hospital people when I asked you not to." Vincent looked at this child, Leah, sitting in his guest cottage, clutching a broken doll and trusting him with the most precious thing she owned, her name. Something inside him shifted, settled, clicked into place like a lock finally finding its key. He suddenly wasn't sure who was saving who. Getting Leah to stay in the guest cottage was like trying to convince a wild cat to wear a collar. She'd agree to one night, then be gone by morning, leaving only a perfectly made bed and a note that said, "Thanks, but I can't owe anybody anything." Vincent would find her back under the slide, curled in her sleeping bag like nothing had changed, except now she'd flash him a grin that held just a little less wariness than before. One day at a time, she finally agreed after he found her shivering through a particularly cold morning. "Like parole. If I hate it, I go back to the slide." It was the strangest negotiation of Vincent's career, and he'd once convinced a oil sheik to lease him an entire city block. "Deal," he said, trying not to show how relieved he felt. But Leah had her own terms. She refused his money, wouldn't accept charity, and insisted on paying for everything. When Margaret brought her breakfast, Leah would only eat it if she could fold hotel laundry afterward. When Vincent offered her clothes from the hotel's lost and found, she'd scrub the lobby floors until they gleamed. "I'm not a project," she said on day 3. when Vincent tried to slip her $20. I work for what I get, or I don't get it. There was pride in her voice that reminded Vincent of himself at that age, stubborn and fierce and determined to prove he didn't need anyone's pity. It was heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. She had opinions about everything. The marble statues in the lobby were too judgy, with their blank eyes that seemed to follow you around. Vincent's collection of perfectly pressed suits was funeral gear, appropriate for a man who seemed determined to bury himself alive. The hotel's overly formal atmosphere made her wrinkle her nose like she smelled something distasteful. "When's the last time anyone laughed in here?" she asked one afternoon, helping Margaret dust the reception area. "I mean really laughed, not that polite rich people chuckling." Margaret paused in her work, feather duster hovering over a crystal vase. "You know, dear, I can't remember. That was the day Leah decided to hack the staff Wi-Fi password, just to prove she could." Vincent found her in the employee break room, surrounded by half the housekeeping staff, showing them funny videos on her phone. "How did you?" he started. "Password was your birthday," she said without looking up. "Not very secure, Mr. Langford. You should really consider something more creative." Vincent stared at her. "How do you know my birthday?" Leah finally glanced up, and her grin was pure mischief. Margaret's desk calendar. "You've got a meeting with the dentist next Thursday, by the way. Might want to reschedule. There's a storm coming." She was like that, full of surprises that caught him off guard. She could pick locks, spoke 3 languages, and had memorized the bus schedules for the entire city. But she also hummed old lullabies while she worked, kept her broken doll tucked safely in her backpack, and sometimes woke up calling for someone named Maria in a voice so small and lost it made Vincent's heart clench. Slowly, carefully, she began to soften around the edges. She asked about the empty picture frame in his office, the one that had been sitting there for years collecting dust. Who was supposed to go there? She asked one evening, curled up in the guest cottage's reading chair with a book Margaret had found for her. Vincent looked up from his laptop, fingers frozen over the keyboard. "What makes you think someone was supposed to go there?" "Empty frames are like empty swings," Leah said with the wisdom of someone who'd learned to read the silences between words. "They're waiting for something that used to be there." Vincent's throat felt tight. "My son," he said quietly. His name was Caleb. Was. The simple question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of 15 years of careful avoidance. Vincent had never said the words out loud to anyone except Margaret, and even then only in the terrible practicalities that followed tragedy. He died when he was 12. Car accident. The words felt like glass in his throat. I wasn't a very good father. We fought about everything. The last thing I said to him was." Vincent stopped, shook his head. "It doesn't matter now." Leah set down her book and looked at him with those 2 old eyes that seemed to see straight through to the parts of him he kept locked away. "It matters," she said simply. "It always matters." She didn't push, didn't pry, didn't offer empty comfort or meaningless platitudes. She just curled back up with her book and let him sit with his confession in the quiet space between them. That night, Vincent couldn't sleep. He found himself walking the halls of his hotel, these familiar corridors that had become his entire world, thinking about a girl who hummed while she worked and a son who died hating him. When he passed the guest cottage, he saw a light still glowing in the window. Leah was awake too, sitting on the small porch, wrapped in one of Margaret's quilts, staring up at the stars. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Thinking too loud," she said. "Sometimes my brain gets stuck on things." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 insomniacs sharing the weight of their respective ghosts. Vincent found himself really looking at her. This child who'd somehow slipped past all his carefully constructed defenses and made herself at home in the empty spaces of his life. "Leah," he said softly, "what happened to your parents? Your real family?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but distant, like she was reading someone else's story. "My mom died 2 years ago. Cancer. She fought it for as long as she could, but..." Leah shrugged, a gesture that tried to be casual but carried the weight of the world. "My dad left when I was 6. Said he never wanted kids anyway, and I was proof he was right." Vincent felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest. The shelters were full, always full, and the foster homes. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "Let's just say some people see kids like me as paychecks instead of people." I learned it was safer on my own. How long? Vincent's voice was barely a whisper. 763 days, she said without hesitation. I've been counting. 763 days. More than 2 years of sleeping under slides and in doorways, of avoiding the system that was supposed to protect her, of learning to make herself invisible because visible meant vulnerable. Vincent's hands were shaking, not with anger, though that would come later, in the quiet fury of a man who'd finally found something worth fighting for. No, this was something deeper, something that felt like recognition. You shouldn't have had to do that, he said. You shouldn't have had to be so strong. Leah looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment her careful mask slipped. Underneath was just a tired child who'd been carrying the world on her shoulders for far too long. Neither should you, she said quietly. And in that moment, sitting on a porch under stars that had witnessed both their sorrows, Vincent Langford realized he'd been wrong about almost everything. He'd thought he was giving this child shelter, but she was the one offering sanctuary. He'd thought he was saving her, but she was busy saving him right back. 3 weeks had passed since Leah moved into the guest cottage, and Vincent's hotel had begun to transform in ways he couldn't have imagined. The marble halls that once echoed with nothing but the click of expensive heels and whispered business conversations now carried something warmer, the sound of actual life being lived. It started small, Leah humming while she helped Margaret arrange flowers in the lobby. The housekeeping staff lingering a few extra minutes in whatever room she was working, drawn by her stories about the interesting people she'd observed on the streets. Even the stern-faced doorman, Mr. Peterson, who hadn't cracked a smile in the 15 years Vincent had known him, was caught chuckling at something Leah had said about the way rich people walked, like they're afraid the ground might ask them for money. But it was the night of the power outage that everything changed. A transformer had blown during a November storm, plunging the entire block into darkness. While Vincent was on the phone with the electric company, growing increasingly frustrated with their timeline estimates, he heard something that stopped him mid-sentence. Laughter. Real laughter, the kind that bubbled up from somewhere deep and genuine and unguarded. He followed the sound to the main lobby, where Leah had gathered the evening staff around a collection of pillar candles Margaret kept for emergencies. She was telling a ghost story, something about a hotel that was so boring, even the spirits fell asleep and started snoring, which explained the strange noises guests sometimes heard at night. And that's when the ghost of the uptight businessman realized, Leah said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper while her face danced in the candlelight, that he'd been haunting the wrong building for 50 years. He was supposed to be in the tax office across the street. Tommy from housekeeping let out a snort of laughter that he tried to disguise as a cough, but it was too late. The dam broke, and suddenly the entire lobby was filled with the sound of people who'd forgotten how to enjoy themselves, remembering what it felt like. Vincent stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching this child, his child, because that's what she'd become without either of them quite realizing it, bringing light to a place that had been dark for so long. Not just dark because of the power outage, but dark in all the ways that mattered. Dark with grief and isolation and the careful distance he'd maintained between himself and anything that might hurt him again. When the power came back an hour later, the staff reluctantly dispersed back to their duties, but the atmosphere had shifted permanently. There was warmth in the air that hadn't been there before, a sense of community that Vincent had never thought to foster, but Leah had created simply by being herself. After everyone had gone to their rooms or home for the night, Leah found Vincent in his office, staring out the window at the city lights that had flickered back to life. "Penny for your thoughts?" she said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. "Just thinking about how different things are," Vincent said. "How different you've made things." Leah was quiet for a moment, picking at a loose thread on her sweater, one of the ones Margaret had found in the hotel's lost and found, though Vincent suspected it had been purchased specifically for her. "Vincent," she said finally, and there was something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. Something serious and a little scared. "I need to tell you something. Before I disappear." "Disappear?" The word hit him like cold water. "What do you mean, disappear?" Instead of answering directly, Leah reached into her backpack and pulled out an envelope, worn soft at the edges like it had been handled many times. She placed it on his desk with the solemnity of someone presenting evidence in a trial. "You should read this," she said. You should read this before I lose my nerve and run away again. Vincent's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope. Inside was a school withdrawal letter, dated 13 months ago, signed by someone named Maria Santos, Leah's mother, he realized. Below it was another piece of paper, this one in Leah's careful handwriting. He read it once, then again, the words blurring as the full weight of what she'd been carrying hit him like a physical blow. I tried, the letter began. I really tried to do everything right after Mom died. I went to the social worker like I was supposed to. I filled out all the forms. I waited in all the right offices with all the right paperwork. But the shelters were full, and the foster homes. Vincent's throat tightened as he read about a system that had failed her at every turn. About adults who saw her as a paycheck or a burden or a problem to be shuffled along to someone else. About nights spent in places that weren't safe and days spent pretending everything was fine because admitting it wasn't meant risking what little stability she'd managed to find. And then I found your playground. The letter continued. And for the first time in 763 days, I slept through the night without wondering if someone was going to hurt me or move me along or forget I existed. I know I'm not supposed to be here. I know you didn't sign up for any of this. But this is the first place I've felt safe since Mom died, and I don't know how to leave it. I don't know how to leave you. The letter ended with a question that broke Vincent's heart. You want me to leave now? Vincent looked up to find Leah watching him with the carefully blank expression she wore when she was preparing for disappointment. Her arms were crossed over her chest like armor, and he could see her mentally calculating the fastest route to the door. Leah, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. Leah, look at me. She met his eyes reluctantly, and he saw in them the same look he'd seen in the mirror for 15 years. The look of someone who'd learned that loving people meant losing them, that opening your heart meant giving the world a target. No, he said, and the word came out fiercer than he'd meant it to. No, you shouldn't have had to ask. You shouldn't have had to wonder. You shouldn't have had to write this letter or sleep under slides or count safe days like they're miracles. The careful mask slipped from Leah's face, revealing the scared child underneath. You don't want me to leave? I don't want you to leave, Vincent said, and the words felt like a confession. I don't want you to leave, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say it out loud. For the first time since he'd known her, Leah's composure completely cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not the careful, silent crying of someone who'd learned to grieve quietly, but the messy, honest sobs of a child who'd finally found a safe place to fall apart. Vincent came around the desk and pulled her into his arms, and she let him. She let him hold her while she cried for her mother and for the father who'd abandoned her, and for all the nights she'd spent wondering if anyone would notice if she simply disappeared. You remind me of someone I lost, Vincent whispered into her hair, thinking of another child who'd needed him and whom he'd failed in all the ways that mattered. But I don't want to lose you too. I can't lose you too. And for the first time in 15 years, Vincent Langford cried in front of another person. Not tears of weakness, but grief long frozen finally allowed to melt. Grief for his son, for the relationship they'd never had, for all the words left unsaid and chances missed. But also something else, something that felt like hope, like the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could get this right the second time. They held each other in that office, surrounded by the remnants of Vincent's carefully constructed isolation, and for the first time in either of their lives, neither of them felt alone. Spring came early that year, arriving with the kind of gentle warmth that made everything feel possible again. Leah had been living in the guest cottage for 6 months, and the transformation in both of them was remarkable. She'd gained weight. Her hair had grown shiny and healthy, and she'd started at a new school where she was making friends for the first time in years. But more than that, she'd brought life back to Vincent's sterile world in ways both large and small. The hotel staff adored her. Guests often commented on the warmer atmosphere, and Vincent found himself smiling more than he had in decades. She called him V now, not Dad, which they both understood was a title that had to be earned rather than claimed, but something softer and more personal than his formal name. It was Leah who suggested they install a swing set in the corner of the playground that actually got used. What's the point of a playground where nobody plays? She'd asked with the devastating logic of youth. So they'd added swings and a seesaw and a sandbox, and on weekend mornings, Vincent would find himself watching from his office window as local families brought their children to play. It was strange how healing it was to see that space filled with laughter instead of ghosts. On this particular morning, Vincent was running late for his usual coffee rounds, caught up in a conference call that had dragged on far longer than necessary. When he finally made it to his office, something stopped him in his tracks. The empty picture frame that had sat on his desk for 15 years, the one Leah had asked about but never pushed him to explain, now held a photograph. A candid shot of Leah on one of the new swings, head thrown back in laughter, her hair flying around her face like a halo. Margaret must have taken it during one of their weekend garden sessions, capturing a moment of pure, unguarded joy. Tucked into the corner of the frame was a note in Leah's careful handwriting, family portrait. Vincent's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't the familiar ache of loss. This was something warmer, fuller, the feeling of a heart that had learned to beat again after years of simply going through the motions. But it was what he found behind the photograph that brought him to his knees. His hands shook as he lifted out a piece of paper he hadn't seen in 15 years, a hospital bill, yellowed with age, bearing the name Caleb Langford, and a date that was burned into his memory. The bill he'd kept in his desk drawer like a talisman of guilt, a reminder of the son he'd failed and lost. Below it, in Leah's handwriting, was a single line. Everyone deserves to be remembered. Your son. Vincent spun around to find Leah standing in the doorway, her school backpack slung over one shoulder, looking nervous but determined. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. I found it when I was looking for a stapler last week, she said quietly, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. I wasn't snooping, I swear. It just fell out when I opened the drawer. Leah, he was my age, she continued, and there was something in her voice that made Vincent really look at her. When he died, 12 years old. Vincent sank into his chair, the weight of 15 years of carefully buried grief pressing down on him like a physical thing. Yes. What was he like? The question caught him off guard. In all the years since Caleb's death, no one had ever asked him that. They'd offered condolences, spoken in platitudes about how sorry they were for his loss, but no one had ever asked about who Caleb had been when he was alive. Stubborn, Vincent said, and despite everything, he found himself almost smiling. God, he was stubborn. Like his father, his mother used to say. He loved baseball and hated vegetables and asked questions about everything. Drove me crazy with all his questions. What kind of questions? Why the sky was blue, why rich people talked funny, why I worked so much. Vincent's voice trailed off as the memories came flooding back. Why I never had time for him. Leah moved closer, settling into the chair across from his desk with the same easy familiarity she'd always shown. Is that why you fought? Vincent nodded, the words feeling like glass in his throat. I was building this empire, you see. This hotel, the reputation, the success. I thought I was doing it for him, for his future. But really, I was doing it for me, for my ego. And he knew it. What was the last thing you said to him? The question Vincent had been avoiding for 15 years hung in the air between them. He'd never said the words out loud, never admitted to anyone the guilt that ate at him every single day. I told him he was ungrateful, Vincent whispered. He'd asked me to come to his baseball game, and I said I was too busy. He said I was always too busy, that work mattered more to me than he did. And I told him he was ungrateful, that he didn't understand what I was sacrificing for him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of words that could never be taken back. He was right, wasn't he? Vincent continued. I was always too busy. Work did matter more to me than he did, or at least I acted like it did. And the last words I ever said to my son were angry ones. Leah was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but sure. Mine too, she said. Kind of. Vincent looked up, surprised. My mom, Leah explained. The last thing I said to her was that I hated the hospital food and why couldn't she just come home already? I was 12, and I was scared, and I didn't understand that she wasn't choosing to stay there. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I spent months hating myself for that, for being such a brat when she was dying. Leah, but you know what I figured out? She continued, leaning forward in her chair. She knew I didn't mean it. Just like your son knew you loved him, even when you were being a workaholic dad. Kids say things when they're hurt or scared. Parents say things when they're stressed or overwhelmed. But underneath all that, the love is still there. Vincent stared at this remarkable child who'd somehow found her way into his life and his heart, offering wisdom that therapists and grief counselors had never been able to give him. "How do you know that?" he asked. Leah's smile was soft and a little sad. "Because you built him a playground. Even after he was gone, even when it hurt to look at it, you built him a place to play. That's not something you do for someone you don't love." The tears came then. 15 years of suppressed grief finally allowed to surface. Vincent cried for his son, for the father he'd been and the father he'd wished he could have been. But he also cried for something else, for the grace of second chances, for the unexpected gift of loving and being loved again. Leah came around the desk and wrapped her arms around him. This child who'd learned too young how to comfort adults who were falling apart. "We both lost someone," she whispered into his shoulder. "I just didn't know I'd find someone after." Vincent pulled back to look at her, this fierce, funny, brilliant girl who'd saved his life by letting him save hers. "You're home now," he said, and the words felt like a promise, like a vow, like the most important thing he'd ever said. "You don't ever have to win to stay. You don't have to earn your place here. You just have to be Leah, and that's enough. That's more than enough." Outside the office window, the playground that had once been a monument to loss had transformed into something else entirely. A place where children laughed and played and made memories that would last a lifetime. The swings creaked gently in the spring breeze, no longer empty, but full of possibility. And in that office, surrounded by pictures of the family they'd chosen to become, a man who'd forgotten how to love and a girl who'd forgotten how to trust learned that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the spaces left behind by grief. The broken pieces of their hearts had found each other, and in the fitting together, they'd become something whole.